Alright, hello everyone. We are coming in for the first video of the month of October. So for our first video of the month, and later this month we'll have at least a Halloween, like a spooky theme video of some sort, delving into history. I'm still debating what topic that's going to end up being, but we'll get to that. But for this first video of the month, we're going to take a look at an aspect of the American Revolution that I don't really think gets a lot of attention, but it's also very interesting as to how things ended up playing out. And when we think about the American Revolution, we think mostly about, okay, 13 colonies versus Britain. Here in the United States, it's almost like a holy war in many aspects of American cultural history. We treat it as, this righteous struggle. Britain sees it pretty much a little bit opposite. I mean, they had every right to feel betrayed on their own end. But we think of it typically as a US versus Britain conflict. We don't really think, what about our northern neighbor? What about Canada? Where was Canada during all this? Why didn't the Canadians, who were also British subjects at the time, why did they not want to join in on this revolution? Why did they choose to remain under British rule and not break away from what the Americans said British tyranny? Why did they choose to supposedly remain under so-called British tyranny if that was the case? And that is an aspect I want to take a look at here. So what we're going to take a look at we're going to take a look at the American Revolution, which I've covered before in the past, but I want to take a look specifically at the aspect of where was Canada during all this? What was going on up north? And why did they ultimately decide that they weren't going to join the other British colonies to their south in rebellion against the crown? So that is where we're going to take a look at today. Just something that I felt would be very interesting to kind of take a look at. And it is kind of interesting because Canada is kind of divided at this time. So, in order to kind of set up the stage for what will lead to the American Revolution and it really did as a whole, we have to look at who used to control Canada back before the American Revolution. And for roughly 2 centuries, the controlling colonial power in what is now Canada was France, not Britain. France had actually had many of its colonies started in North America along the St. Lawrence River. They had founded cities like Montreal and Quebec, and they had founded those cities as basically the main capital of this new colonial possession of theirs that they would end up calling New France as the years went on. They also had colonies up in Acadia, which is like where Nova Scotia is now, and New Brunswick, and that was also partly theirs. And France had dominated this region for quite some time. It was, I believe, one of the first areas they colonized in North America. They also had sent an expedition down the Mississippi River and through the Great Lakes with Joliet, I believe it was. But the main French colony in North America was along the St. Lawrence River, along Canada and the Great Lakes. And at one time, the very land here that I am living in Ohio, this was technically part of France at one time. This was once part of New France before 1763. It was disputed, of course, but France more or less held claim to the northern part. It was more the Ohio Valley down south that was much more in question. So what ended up happening here is France is the colonial power, and while it's in Canada, France builds an economy for its French colonial possession mostly built on the fur trade with the indigenous Native American tribes. This is what the bolster of the colonial economy was in the colony of New France, as the French had called it. It was mostly based on the fur trade of beaver pelts, of any kind of animal pelts that they could get their hands on for money or for tools that of value to the Native Americans that they could use, such as guns, ammo, horses, stuff that they couldn't get on their own, but they loved to buy from European markets. That was the main economic driving factor in the colony of New France. As thus, it wasn't as lucrative as French colonies in the Caribbean here, say, that might be producing things like sugar and molasses and rum, and things that are much higher demand in some instances than a simple fur coat. And thus, France, although it was the headquarters pretty much of the North American possessions, it wasn't necessarily the most valuable. And that would really come to be shown when the French and Indian War would come about in 1754. And in 1754, Britain and France would clash in the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War, and over here in North America, we call it the French and Indian. Same conflict, different name for the different theaters it went. It was really one of the world's first world wars because Britain and France did not only engage in Europe, but they engaged in North America, they engaged in India, they engaged almost anywhere they had colonial possessions. And it started in 1754. And France, initially during the war, and this was another topic that we covered, I'll be sure to put a link to both these at the end of the video. But the French and Indian War, at first it goes well for the French. The French actually managed to use their Native American allies. They have much better relations with many of the Native American tribes, and they use that to advantage because the British are very much going to North America thinking this is going to be a European-style war. We're going to march in lines, finely ranked columns, and we're going to fire each other the traditional warfare way. The French have taken, in North America at least, the aspect of the indigenous Native Americans of the hit-and-run tactic, of the guerrilla fighting that we would see today, where they go into woods, they hide behind trees, behind bushes, rocks, anything they can hide upon. They don't wear these brightly colored uniforms. They do not line up in single-fire lines, and they just take their shots and then either reload or run. And this is not something that the British are prepared for, and in many cases has spelled the end of them. The very opening of the war with the assault toward French-held Fort Duquesne, where Pittsburgh is now, ended up being a disaster for the expedition led by Edward Braddock, because he ended up getting killed with his men as they marched through the woods in single file line and down a trail, and then got hit by this French ambush with their Native American allies. Braddock himself ended up being killed, and the British forces were then led into retreat by Braddock's second in command, George Washington, who at the time was a British officer. So initially, the war goes very well for the French. But by about 1758, so 4 years into the conflict, things are starting to turn. Britain's economic might is really starting to come into play here. They have a new prime minister who is much more willing to really bring the fight to France than the previous prime minister had done, and he's really focused on revitalizing Britain's war effort. And this leads to the British starting to gain the upper hand in the conflict by 1758, about 4 years in. Within 2 years after that, in the year 1760, British forces had taken the fight into French Canada itself, into New France, and in that very year, they ended up taking the main city of Quebec, which then caused France to start seeking peace as compensation. They had lost pretty much their capital of New France. They lost Quebec City, which was one of their oldest settlements that they had established all the way back in like 1608. And this leads to them deciding that, okay, it's time to throw in the towel. We're losing this by a massive long shot at this point. And 3 years later, in 1763, the war would end with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. We have to say that because there was also a Treaty of Paris for many other years, including in 1783, 20 years later, that would recognize the end of the American War of Independence. So the 1763 Treaty of Paris officially ended the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War / whatever you want to call it. It ends the war between Britain and France, and as a consequence, France loses almost all of its North American possessions. It loses almost its entire colonial empire in North America, with the small exception of, I believe, Haiti was still left in their control, and there was 2 small fishing islands off the coast of Newfoundland that they still actually own today, St. Pierre and I can't even remember the name. The other one starts with an M, but I can't even remember the name of it. But St. Pierre is one. But they're little fishing islands, and it's really the only 2 French possessions I think they have about left in North America from prior to 1763. And France ends up ceding the entire colony of New France in Canada to Britain. Canada is now under British control. There's no French government there at all. And this is going to change things drastically because although the French government may be gone and the French colony is gone, there are still many, many French colonists who decide, we're not leaving. This is our home. We were born here. We were raised here. I'm not just going back to France because the government changed. And that is going to set up a little bit of tension going into the next 10 years. So before we continue here, I want to show you, this is a map of North America at about the time the French and Indian War would break out. So this is about 1754, North America, at least Eastern North America, more or less, because we aren't really looking out here to the west. So orange is anything that Spain controls here. So Spain controls all this orange. So they control Mexico, Texas, out in the southwest. They control Florida. So they're more to the south. Britain's main possessions here are what will become the first 13 states of the United States along the eastern seaboard. That is British possession, the 13 colonies. And then they also have these purple areas that have been ceded to Britain back at the end of the War for Spanish Succession. And these were given to them back all the way in 1713. And that is like, this would become Rupert's Land, which was technically a company thing that had already kind of been under British control, but just reconfirmed because I think France had managed to conquer it and then they had to give it back. British also gained Newfoundland, and they gained this part of what is now Nova Scotia, where Halifax is. And all this blue, so here's Acadia. This is the Acadia region I've been talking about. This is where Halifax, Nova Scotia is. This is also where New Brunswick is. It's that part that touches Maine and where the St. Lawrence comes in. This is Nova Scotia and all that. So this is Acadia. And then all this blue was French territory. So it goes all the way down to Louisiana and New Orleans. Goes up the Mississippi River Valley. They control the Great Lakes almost entirely. They go a little bit out here, but the main heart of New France is along the St. Lawrence River Valley right here with Quebec and Montreal. That is the main heart of everything for them. And unfortunately for them, unfortunately for our little friends here, they lost all of that. And now all that is British territory. That is now part of Britain, going to be administered by Britain, so that's going to all be different now after 1763. So what would immediately happen afterward? The former French colony of Canada, as the French had officially named it used to be called the French colony of Canada. Quebec was more of a city. It was not a specific country. It was not a colony at that time. The French colony of Canada along the St. Lawrence River was officially incorporated into Britain's other Canadian possessions that they gained from the end of the war. And the British were the ones that actually renamed the province. They got rid of the name Canada entirely and renamed the region around, with Quebec as its capital city, renamed it the province of Quebec. They also established the province of Nova Scotia, and they also had Rupert's Land up to the north. There is no Canada at the time. After 1763, any mention of the word Canada is pretty much gone as a colonial name. Now, there are like Canadians. There's Canadien, as the French sometimes would call it up toward there, but there is no Canada. It's multiple different little British colonies. There's St. John's or St. Jean. I will call it St. John's by the British name, but it used to be a French one. They simply translated it into English. But there is no united Canada. It's multiple British colonies, little small colonies, but Quebec is by far the largest that comes out of this. And they had renamed it the province of Quebec. Quebec would serve as the capital city. And among the treaty terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, it gave French Canadians living in Canada an opportunity to leave if they so wished, recognizing that they were technically French by ethnicity. They may still wish to be part of the French kingdom, and thus, if you wanted to, we will give you every opportunity and help you leave if you want to in order to stay with your home country. Of course, as we mentioned, many of them had been born there, raised there. They had no intention of wanting to leave because this was their home. They don't want to leave. They don't mind if there's a small governmental change until they realize what that would mean, only after the fact. So although there was a provision in the treaty that allowed French Canadians to leave Canada and an opportunity if they so wished to, many of them chose to stay. If they chose to stay, then the treaty made it very clear that they would become British subjects, if that was the case, since this was now British lands. However, this is where problems started to occur, because the French Canadians, as the British would also call them, the other name that they gave them was kind of weird, was they called these people new subjects, even though they had already been in Canada, and they called the new British immigrants arriving into Canada the old subjects, because technically the old subjects, or the English immigrants arriving, they had already been British subjects from before the war. These new French Canadians, they were pretty much new subjects to the British Crown. Even though they had already lived in Canada, they had been part of France before. So it was kind of weird how they gave the names to them a little bit. But things rapidly change when it goes toward trying to integrate these people into the wider British colonial realm, because some of the things that end up happening anger the Canadians quite a bit, especially around Quebec and Montreal. And some of the things that were angering them to some degree was, one thing was, in order to serve in public office, they would have to swear an oath of loyalty to the king. Now, you might think on paper, well, that's not that bad. They probably swore an oath of loyalty to the King of France when it was a French colony, which is true, they probably did. The problem comes to religion. And as you may well know, England at this point is heavily Protestant. Catholicism has been almost completely eradicated from England at that point. It's not highly encouraged. And France is still, even to this day, France is majority Roman Catholic. It is a Catholic country, and that kind of causes some religious tension. And as part of this oath to the loyalty to the king, they're taking the same oath that has been in place since the time of Queen Elizabeth I, back during the Tudor dynasty. And Elizabeth, mind you, had been the one that come to power after her Catholic half-sister Mary, who tried to reinstate Catholicism. And although Elizabeth was much more accepting of Catholics, she still required that anyone in her government had to be mostly Protestant. And thus, in this oath of loyalty, there were certain provisions that basically denounced Catholicism that they would have to say in these oath of loyalty. And because of the oath containing provisions that rejected the Catholic faith, most French Canadians, or Quebecois, as I think they're also called, most of the French Canadians, they would not take the oath because it was an affront to their religion. It was an affront to their faith. We're not going to switch our religion for you. We're willing to stay here and live where we've always lived, but I'm not switching my religion just to serve in government. And because of that, this prevented a large number of these new subjects from actually participating in the local governments that were being set up in order to administer the colony. So even though these are the majority of the population, because of their Roman Catholic faith and because of the oath of loyalty to the king requiring that they pretty much denounce their faith, they wouldn't take it. They wouldn't absolutely avoid it, and they thus, as a consequence, couldn't serve in local government until they did. The old subjects, or subjects of Britain before the war, ended up, because of this, since they're the ones holding primarily the reins of power, since they have no problem taking the oath, they end up wanting to replace Quebec's old laws and its Catholic religion with English law and Protestantism. They want to pretty much anglicize the colony. They want no trace of any French culture. They want no trace of Catholic religion. That needs to go. We need to is an English possession now. It needs to be English in everything that it does. And this is the view of these new English immigrants coming from England and all of its possessions of the British Isles. This is the view of them. And since they're holding the reins of power in the colony, they can kind of enforce what they wish. So as unrest grows in the North American colonies to the south, as we well know, Britain was heavily in debt after the end of the French and Indian War after 1763, and since they saw that they had gained in North America and that their 13 colonies, which had supported the war effort, they had seemingly gained quite a lot. France had always been that enemy on the frontier that was inciting Native American attacks against them at times. France had always been the threat to their north that could invade them at any time and take them and make them French subjects. With the war won and France pretty much kicked out of North America, they had won probably more than any other British territory in terms of benefits. And Britain saw this, and Britain rightly judged that, well, if you are benefiting the most, it's only fair that you should help pay for the debts down for the war effort. Now, it is still up to debate to this day of how much of the taxes were legitimately fair. I do believe it was within Britain's right to tax the American colonies. They were British colonies, and they had every right to tax them as a territory. However, I do disagree with the fact over some of the taxes that Britain put were quite excessive, and I do see the colonist argument where they argued, well, why are we getting taxed up the wazoo when we don't even have representation in Congress? Shouldn't we have, not Congress, but Parliament? So why should we be getting taxed up the wazoo without having any say in the matter? Shouldn't we not at least have say to speak our opinion of this? And that was the main argument going there. And this debate primarily over taxation and how much they're getting taxed on all goods from tea to stamps to newspapers to any paper public documents were being taxed. This starts infuriating the North American colonies. And it starts making them resent Britain. Britain also establishes the proclamation line of 1763 that pretty much forbids Western settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This infuriates the colonists further. They had fought the war with Britain primarily because they thought if we gain all this territory, we're going to be able to go we're going to be able to go west and finally settle in these lands that constantly we couldn't go into because of the French kind of being there, and that would possibly get us in conflict with them. But then Britain started experiencing Native American rebellions, and in order to keep the Native Americans down, and they were trying to pay off a war debt, they weren't going to go into another conflict. Britain rightly assumes that, okay, we're going to say that you guys aren't moving to the Native American land. If you don't move into their land, they'll calm down. And this upsets the colonies because now they're saying, okay, so we fight a war for you. Now we're paying the bill, which honestly they should pay part of the bill. I don't know why that was so egregious at times. And we're not allowed to move into the land that we helped you seize? How is that beneficial? Which I suppose you could make some argument there that every benefit that the colony, that Britain could argue, well, you're paying the taxes because you got benefits. The colonists could say, what benefits? You took them away. And this starts growing unrest, as we well know in American history. And because of the unrest that's growing in the 13 North American British colonies to the south, Britain is growing a little bit anxious over the factor that, okay, we already know these colonies are kind of getting angsty. They're getting a little, like, in some cases, it's almost outright rebellion at this point. They start looking to the north and like, okay, these French Canadians, these French Canadians or Canadians, these former French subjects, they're also quite angry, and they could possibly join together with these rebellious usurpers in the south. So maybe we ought to do something to accommodate them before they start going along the lines of what their southern neighbors have. And this comes to Britain's attention that this might need to be something that they need to do. Because in the province of Quebec alone, 99% of the population, which was about 90,000 people, were French, were of French ancestry. They were French Canadians. So about 99% of the province of Quebec's population alone was of French ancestry, and thus felt like they were being excluded from being assimilated into the larger British colonial realm. And there was very little immigration going on from Great Britain, so there was a great fear that if this continued, the province of Quebec could possibly join the 13 colonies to the south in open rebellion if it came to it. So Britain starts seeing this. Primarily, its royal governors start seeing this. Quebec's royal governor, James Murray, and his successor, Guy Carleton, both become very aware of this problem, and they start advocating to Parliament and to the King that there needs to be some kind of a change in the province in order to avoid similar unrest from unfolding there. What would ultimately result was what we call the Quebec Act of 1774, roughly just 1 year before the American Revolution would officially break out. So in 1774, Parliament would pass what they called the Quebec Act in hopes of better integrating Quebec and its Canadian population into the wider British realm. And some of the things that this act did, in some ways, it's very crucial, and we're going to go over that here once we go through the reasons. So what the Quebec Act does is several things. First thing, regarding religion. The act would protect the Catholic majority by removing the previous oath of loyalty to Elizabeth I that basically included all these provisions to basically disavow Catholicism and go full-on Protestant. It gets rid of the old oath of loyalty and instead instates a new one to King George III and his heirs, which made absolutely no reference to Protestantism. Now, with the oath switched, these French Canadians can feel like, okay, we can take the oath now. We're not disavowing our religion, and Britain also is enabling the Canadians to practice their religion freely. Even though you're Catholic, and even though we're a Protestant nation, we're not going to persecute you for being Catholic. We understand that is your faith. That was your faith before we came and conquered you. You are allowed to keep that, and we're not going to require you to drop that for, going into government. This is roughly 2 centuries after the Reformation. They're starting to get over that point to some degree now. And that is very much what happens here. So we fixed the religion problem that was barring so many of the French Canadians from actually joining the local governments. And as a consequence, many of them could now participate in large numbers in local government, which will make them feel much more included and more in control of their own colony. And it would also change some other things as well. Structure of government. The governor, this wasn't really a massive change, but simply set up how it was going to be. The governor was to be appointed by the crown, by the king, and would govern with the assistance of a legislative council. However, I do not believe the legislative council was by any means elected. I believe it was more handpicked, but they would have an advisory council. Law was another thing that was a major change. Mind you, we said that the Anglo-English settlers, pretty much, that had come across and immigrated to Canada after the war to Quebec, they had wanted to change it to English law and get rid of the French law entirely that the French-Canadiens had been used to for roughly 2 centuries. So what ends up changing is pretty much the British decide, okay, so you are a British colony, so it's only fair that you're going to have to accept English law. But we will allow you to continue to use French law in all matters of property or civil rights. If it involves property or civil rights, we're still going to allow you to use your traditional French law in order to resolve those things. But when it comes to things that are public law or criminal law, you will refer to the English system. So it's allowing almost a hybrid of the law system to be used, where yes, you are going to adapt to the British system, but in certain instances, lower level ones, you will still be able to use your traditional French order of law that you have used for roughly 2 centuries, which appeases them on that note. And it also does some land changes to Quebec that's going to be more of an impact to the Americans. It would restore the French system of land distribution that Britain had replaced with townships in 1763, which the French system was much more familiar to the Canadians, and they would thus kind of be more comfortable when it came to dividing up land and understanding how that was going to work. It would also expand the province's boundaries to include land that now comprises the U.S. states of Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, as well as Canadian Ontario. So Quebec is pretty much established already, and it gets expanded to include, I think I have a picture of it here. Yep, there we do. So this is what Quebec gets expanded to from the Quebec Act in 1774. It goes from being merely in Canada, so now Quebec is not just its original spot up here by the St. Lawrence, but we're now going to include pretty much what is Ontario now, and we're going down into Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, part of Wisconsin, Indiana, even some of Minnesota. All this is now part of the province of Quebec, and this is a direct snub to the American colonies over here that say, hey, we wanted to expand out here and you barred us, but now you're letting Quebec do it? Our former enemy, even though they just got included into the empire and haven't even been loyal subjects for that long? And now you're letting them take the land? Like, what the heck, dude? This did not sit well with the 13 colonies at all. It did not sit well with them, period, that Britain was now expanding Quebec's borders, and it did anger them quite a bit. The Quebec Act would do large service toward calming the Canadian unrest that was unfolding with the French-Canadian natives that had lived there. So this does a large part to kind of keep them from doing what their southern neighbors are doing, because a lot of their grievances have been solved. They now have protection for their religion. They can be included in local government. They can also go off French law for some bit, and they've even gotten they've even got the French system of land distribution back and got an expanded province. Britain's done marvelous wonder for them with this act. It appeases them drastically to the point that they're not really considering open rebellion now. And that is going to change things. The colonists in the 13 colonies, however, they are, oh my goodness, it's like someone opened Pandora's box. They are so irate that Quebec has gotten these, specifically the land changes is what they were more or less angered about. And they would actually later cite the Quebec Act as one of 27 grievances in the Declaration of Independence as to why they were going ahead and declaring independence. This was one of the 27 reasons that Thomas Jefferson would include in the Declaration as a grievance against Great Britain's rule. So that leads us right up to the year of the American Revolution. 1775, Lexington Concord happened, and revolution is now on its way. Now, the Patriot leaders in the American colonies, they were initially divided in actually seeking any kind of cooperation with their northern French-Canadian counterparts. Many of them wanted to unite all of Britain's colonies in rebellion, all of the North American British colonies into one whole, but there are many who distrust the Canadians as a former enemy, because they keep in mind, they are French, they might be hesitant to British rule, because of what happened, so many years ago, and back in 1763, not that long, less than 20 years ago. But keep in mind, we were also their enemy for the longest time until that war. Until the end of that war, we were also their enemy. They were an enemy to us. So they didn't really, there were many within the leadership of the American Revolution that didn't really want to extend the cooperation branch of, to say, to the French-Canadians to the north. They knew that the Anglo immigrants were probably not going to really be willing to join this revolution, but they knew that the French ones would probably be more hesitant to conform to British rule and might just be a little bit more leaning toward getting out of it real quick. So that was their hope, at least. Others would see that maybe this is the route we need to take if we're going to unite the colonies. So the First Continental Congress met in September of 1774, and it would adopt anti-Catholic and pro-rights proposals in order to gain support at home. And then a year later, when the revolution actually breaks out, that's going to change. And it even changed real quick because, mind you, this was September, so they're putting anti-Catholic and pro-rights proposals into, the resolutions that they pass, which is definitely going to be a turnoff. The anti-Catholic part would be a turnoff to any French-Canadians up north that do not want to, actually join with the Americans. And this is going to be a major driver. But then within a month, by October 26th of 1774, the Continental Congress is now issuing an address to the inhabitants of Quebec to try to enlist the aid of all of them in order to get them to join in. And they're like, why would we join you after you just denounced our religion? Like, what sense does that make? Now, the Continental Congress would express hope that former enemies in that address in October of 1774, that former enemies could become friends during this renewed period of, hostility toward British rule, and they thought that maybe that could be the case. Now, the Second Continental Congress would meet after Lexington Concord in April of 1775, and when the Second Continental Congress would meet, they would urge many of the Canadians up north, and I say Canadians at this point because at this point they're going not just for the French Canadians, but they're going for also many of the English immigrants that have gone in. So just Canadians in general at this point. They're urging Canadians to join the Confederation, and they're promising religious liberty if they do. They wanted to encourage the Canadians to revolt against British rule, and Congress agreed to organize a military expedition to take Montreal and Quebec in the hopes that if they could do so, it would weaken any kind of chance of a British offensive from the north. So this was rather, to put it in the words of how we should just say it nowadays, it was rather ballsy of Congress right off the bat. A war has just started with your motherland, and you're pretty much deciding, yeah, we're going to go on the offensive right from the start. Yeah, against what is supposed to be the most powerful empire in the world, and you're going to go on the offensive from the get-go. That took some balls, to put it bluntly. And George Washington would actually be the one that would write an address. He would send an address to go toward this Canadian expedition up north, and he sent an address to the Canadians stating that Congress was sending an army under General Philip Schuyler, quote, not to plunder, but to protect you. That we're fellow subjects of the crown, and we're both being violated in our rights. We are not here to plunder you. We see you as fellow British subjects, and we are not going to hurt you. We're not here to destroy your towns or anything. We're just here to protect you against the tyrannies of what Parliament has been doing and the King. In December of 1775, the army would march north and occupy Montreal. They actually managed to occupy Montreal. General Richard Montgomery, who was the other half of the expedition, along with General Philip Schuyler, he did deliver Congress's promises once occupying Montreal, but then proceeded to Quebec City and left David Wooster in charge of the American occupation of Montreal. So he gives this address to the Canadian inhabitants of Montreal, telling them, "Oh yes, we're here to protect you. We're not here to plunder. I mean, we're just trying to protect you. So we're going to march to Quebec City. If you want to join us, join us. And if not, I'm going to leave my second in command here, General David Wooster. I'm going to leave him in charge while I'm gone." That ends up being a big mistake because Wooster is not as nice as Montgomery is when it comes to this, and he kind of hurts the efforts because Wooster ends up arresting any loyalists that he can find in Montreal that are diehard loyalists to the British crown, and then he clamps down on the Catholic clergy in the city, which then caused protests among Montreal's citizens who now aren't all that willing to, join these Americans that have come up north. these American rebels, and this leaves the French-Canadiens divided, because some of them, they're more than willing to try to shake off British rule because they just got under it less than 20 years before. They're still kind of longing for the days of when they were not under British rule, and they see this as an opportunity. Other French Canadians are comfortable with the way that things have come, especially after the Quebec Act a year before. They see no reason why to throw off the yoke of Britain when they've gained so much in their eyes. Now, British governor of the province of Quebec was Guy Carleton, and he was also having some difficulty raising military forces just as much as the Americans were, partly because of the divisions that existed within the province. Some Anglo-Canadians were actually inclined to side with the Americans just as much as the French-Canadians. However, not all of them were. And for the Quebecois, they were also divided. The French-Canadians / Quebecois in Quebec, the French ancestry, they're divided, but many are going to opt to be neutral. Mainly, the gentry and the clergy within the Canadians, they would mainly remain loyal to the government, but it was more the commoners that would lean toward the American rebels in support of them. Many, however, were not willing to defend the province against an American invasion and were more inclined to kind of wait it out and see what events transpired to see if the Americans could even capture the land and hold it, and if they could actually gain the loyalties of the different Canadian peoples up in the province, not just themselves, not just the French, but also the British, ones of British ancestry. So they were more willing to wait and see how things actually played out before actually making any kind of a decision of who they were going to support. Now, the American assault on Quebec City was kind of rushed because many of the soldiers' commissions were only for the year, and many of them were due to expire on New Year's Day of 1776, meaning that once their commissions expired, many of the soldiers planned on marching right back home because they were no longer technically under military command. And knowing this, General Montgomery had to kind of speed up, and he issued an assault on New Year's Eve, December 31st of 1775, on Quebec City during the middle of a blizzard. Not exactly the best time to be launching an attack on a well-fortified British stronghold. That was much more well-fortified than Montreal had been. The city had much more troops, it was well-supplied, and it had strong fortifications that the British had already worked on what had existed since the French colonial days. What ended up happening was General Montgomery ended up being killed, leaving his wounded colonel, Benedict Arnold, who would later be the traitor, to actually start the retreat back from Quebec City to Montreal in order to take American forces back away from Quebec, and the Americans never really got up to Quebec again. This is a picture here. This is the governor at the time of Quebec. This was Guy Carleton, who kind of was the one that was having trouble even getting the Canadian population in the province, both the Anglo-Canadians and the French-Canadiens, to actually come together against these American rebels because they're divided. And this is a painting that was done by John Trumbull in 1786, I believe. So roughly about 12 years after this, 12 or 11 years after this had happened, depicting the death of General Montgomery at the Battle of Quebec in December of 1775 during that blizzard. So as the American forces would retreat back to Montreal, they would headquarter there over the summer. They would not leave. They weren't going to just leave it. That's where they're going to stay. And they're going to go back to Montreal and make it their winter headquarters. As the American forces would remain in Quebec in early 1776, the Continental Congress would send a commission led by none other than Benjamin Franklin to recruit more Canadian support for the Patriot cause. They would reach Montreal on April 29th. However, when the commission arrived, many of the American troops there were diseased with smallpox, and they were starving, and they looked half ragged. They didn't look like they were anyway going to be able to beat British, and this did not exactly instill confidence in the local Anglo-Canadians or the French-Canadiens. This did not instill confidence within them, and thus they weren't all that massively successful in recruiting many of the local population to their cause. However, there were still some that decided to enlist with the American cause. Some Canadian regiments were raised earlier than the sending of the commission, but their numbers plummeted, which then caused them to be filled with American troops as replacements. So although they may have started out as an actual authentic Canadian unit, they very quickly became a Canadian unit in name only because many of their members that were replaced ended up being people from like New England or anywhere near the border that were more American than they were Canadian. Immigrant James Livingston had actually reportedly recruited over 1,000 Canadians into his first, what he called the 1st Canadian Regiment in November of 1775, but by April, only about 200 of those men actually remained. And there was a second one that had been formed. Moses Hazen was a New Englander who had actually moved to the British colony in Canada of St. John after 1763. He recruited on behalf of Congress in January of 1776, but by April he held only about 250 men in his 2nd Canadian Regiment. Both of the Canadian regiments that were formed would end up marching south with the Continental Army when it retreated from Montreal for good in June of 1776. So as soon as spring got fully underway and the spring thaw had come, the Americans left Canada. They were not, Quebec, because there is no Canada at that time. So they leave Quebec for good. They leave Montreal and go back to New England. And that was really the last of it that they would see on a major scale. It was the most significant. It was the first American broad military campaign of the war very early on. It was an offensive one that they took, I believe. It was the only offensive one that they took that early on. And it really did give a boost in some pride that they had been able to hold Montreal, but the loss at Quebec had kind of hurt American morale. And they come back, and they aren't really able to mount ever another assault to that degree again. They do want to try, though. There's multiple voices in the Continental Congress who are more than advocating for another invasion of Quebec and trying to gain that to join their cause, but many of the other members of the Congress saw it as a futile effort. In 1779, the Americans would try again to invade Quebec. Washington would send Hazen's 2nd Canadian Regiment up to the upper Connecticut River Valley in Vermont, what is now Vermont, at the time it was part of New Hampshire, to blaze a possible route to St. John's. However, this wasn't really meant to be a full-fledged invasion. This was more meant to be a diversion, because Washington was sending General Sullivan's offensive against the Iroquois Confederation in northern New York, and he kind of wanted to divert British attention so that they didn't aid the Native Americans in that little campaign. The new Quebec governor, Frederick Haldimand, knew of the road building that was going along the upper Connecticut River Valley, and he deployed regular and militia units to stop any possible invasion towards St. John, which ended up stopping Hazen's units flat in their tracks. Battle would actually never come between these two opposing forces, as Hazen was actually ordered in September to retreat by Washington himself. Despite the desires to try at Canada, the Continental Army would actually, after 1776, gradually began to focus more and more on securing the independence of just the 13 colonies and trying to more go on the defensive in many cases, and thus they really didn't have the resources or the manpower to be sending on these, fanciful dreams of invading Quebec and all that, which, by the way, the British are sending more reinforcements over as the war is dragging on, so the British defenses in Quebec are only getting stronger. It's not going to be easier to seize it as the war goes on. It's going to be harder. If you couldn't get it the first time, that was like your one and only shot. And the Americans, however, didn't completely give up on the idea. When the Articles of Confederation would come out, Article 11 in particular actually extended an invitation to Quebec/Canada, as I believe it's referred to in the article, to join the nation at any time of its choosing. However, Congress did not push it. They did not push the issue. They just kind of said, hey, to the north, if you'd like to join us, feel free to. We'd take you in. And the Quebec kind of just ignores it. They don't even pay attention to it. And we do have a book here I had a couple months ago when we discussed the articles that I believe we can look up that very article in the Articles of Confederation. So let us take a look here. Articles of Confederation, they were adopted in 1778, so about a year before that second expedition that didn't even really happen with Hazen towards St. John's. So if we go to Article 11, yes. Article 11 of the Articles of Confederation states the following, that Canada, acceding to this confederation and joining in the measures of the United States, shall be admitted into and entitled to all the advantages of this union, but no other colony shall be admitted into the same unless such admission be agreed to by 9 states. So there's 13 states and they want a majority, but Canada has pretty much a free pass. Canada, they're saying, if you want to join us, we only require the 9-state majority to approve you. You can just join. So they put the invitation in there. It never happened. It never did happen. Another one that we have to keep in mind here at the same time is what Nova Scotia saw a little bit of action as well, but nowhere near as enough as Quebec has did as well. And just in case you don't remember where Nova Scotia is, I do suppose it will show this first. Here's a map showing the expedition that we had to Quebec in the latter half of 1775 here. So this one here is Montgomery's route, and the other one is going to be Arnold's route. So Montgomery would go up from Lake Champlain. They would take Montreal. They occupied Montreal, then moved up, tried to go to Quebec. Arnold would meet him up here, and this is where they would see defeat, was up here in Quebec City. And they would not really come back again for some time. This here is the colony of New Hampshire, which was one of the 13 original states. And then here, just in case we don't know where Nova Scotia is, this is where Nova Scotia is. Right here, Acadia. What used to be French Acadia is now Nova Scotia. Later, right after the American Revolution ended, Britain would also establish New Brunswick there as well in 1784. But that was a year after the treaty had ended. So Nova Scotia would also be divided, mainly because it had a split population as well. But its split population was more along the line of the French Acadians and the new Anglo immigrants who were more than often Scottish. There were a lot of people of Scotch descent that settled in Nova Scotia, and this causes a split. Many of the Scottish settlers, of course, are more willing to side with the crown, and many of the French Acadians are sympathetic to the American rebels. The government in Halifax would vote in favor of loyalty to the crown, while illegal town halls would give covert support to New England rebels at the time, just across the border. During the war, Nova Scotia would primarily become a target of American privateering raids. There would be towns that would get burned along the coastlines by American privateers. There were small naval engagements off the coast. And later in the war, when France got involved, there were actual larger naval battles that would occur off Halifax between the British fleet and the French fleet. But Nova Scotia is pretty much plagued by privateering raids during the war. In 1776, New England rebels did try to launch a rebellion in Nova Scotia in order to try to seize the colony as a whole, and even had some disaffected Nova Scotians take part in that attack. However, they would attack Fort Cumberland, the main British military defensive stronghold in the region, and while they did lay siege to it, they failed to actually take the fort and press the garrison inside enough before British reinforcements started arriving from Halifax, which caused them to be defeated and retreat entirely out. And that was pretty much Nova Scotia during the war. There was a lot of privateering raids. There were cross-border raids. There was that one major attack where they tried to seize it, but not a whole lot of other action. Nothing like compared to Quebec had been. After the defeat at Yorktown in October of 1781, Britain would actually begin peace negotiations finally, as we well know, and within 2 years, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 would recognize American independence, and it would give the United States all of the land south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River down to Spanish Florida. So the Ohio and Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin, Michigan, those got taken away from Quebec and given to the United States, which was the new nation at that point. The lasting legacy of the American Revolution, really, to the Canadians at least, was it did see the Loyalists settle in Canada. As we know, there were Loyalist colonists within the 13 colonies who remained loyal to the British Crown. And after the war, many of them did not want to stay in the United States and left the United States because they had been persecuted for their loyalty. And there was over 80,000 Loyalists who would then migrate north and settle into what is now Canada. Many of them would settle, at least a majority, into Quebec and the maritime territories of Nova Scotia and newly founded New Brunswick, and they would settle there, while others would spread throughout the other Canadian possessions. So after the war, Canada decided ultimately, because it was pretty much satisfied from the reforms that Britain had brought just before the war. However, it did see some divide, and there was some willingness from some of the Canadians to take part in the revolution. There just wasn't this wide overreaching one because of the compensation they'd gotten from Britain relatively recently that had calmed them down from going down the same path that the 13 colonies were going. And after the war, now there's a large population of American loyalists that have now migrated up to Canada, up to Quebec, and eventually that would kind of contribute toward these people kind of always having the suspicion of this large Republican state to their south that for almost a century, Canada or Quebec, or all the different British Canadian possessions would rightly fear. they would rightly fear the growing power of the United States to their south, fearing that one day it may try to invade them. Of course, that would happen again during 1812 on a much larger scale, but that was still a couple years down the road yet. So that's what I wanted to take a look at today, was mostly, look at a time in Canada that I don't think is really given a lot of look at, and at the efforts that were made to try to include it in the American Revolution, and how it just didn't really click there as the idea of revolution just did not click in Britain's Canadian possessions as it did in its 13 colonies. It just never really grasped on. It never got a grip as it did elsewhere. And that was just something I wanted to take a look at, because I don't think it's really afforded a lot of attention compared to others. So that is all for this video. So next week, we'll be back for our next video. I don't know what that's going to be yet, but I have ideas. As I said, I'm working on some different topic videos for the month. And of course, we know we'll have that president's one at some point this month. That's a given, but we still got to pick other ones, of course. So if anyone has any videos, any topics that you would like to suggest, be sure to put those in, and I'll be more than happy to take them under serious consideration right now, if anyone has anything they would specifically like to hear about. And as always, any comments, any of that, also put it in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to go through them and answer any of them or respond to them when I can. So until next week, hopefully everyone stays well, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when that comes out.